Hey everyone, my name is Blake Carroll and I'm an undergrad student here at Emporia State University and I'm in the psychology program. And my experiment study was, does positive or negative feedback affect college students' performance on a math test? So, do you ever let past test scores dictate the outcome of your future tests? A 1982 study, in a 1982 study, researchers found that people are more inclined to accept positive perceptions of themselves as opposed to negative perceptions. In a 1974 study, students who were randomly assigned as high scores actually did better on an exam as opposed to students that were selected as low scores. In a more recent study in 2015, researchers found that positive and specific feedback did increase future quiz scores. So, with that taken into some consideration, I predicted that if participants received positive feedback after completing a math test, that they would do better on a second math test as opposed to participants that were given negative feedback. So I had 38 undergrad students as my participants, 10 male, 27 women, and one other. The average age for my participants was about 18 years old. I had 25 freshmen, 11 sophomores, and 2 juniors. I got all my participants from the psychology department research pool, which was a sign up sheet in Canvas. And that is my ESU IRB approval number. Materials. So I had 2 math tests. They were not multiple choice, they were text entries. Math test A consists of 15 math questions, and math test B also consisted of 15 math questions. The Are You Harvard material survey consisted of 3 demographic items, which was age, class, and gender. It also included 13 Likert scale items, which ranged from 1 to 7, 1 being I strongly disagree with this statement, and 7 being I strongly agree with this statement. This was a 2-group independent design experiment. My independent variable was the type of feedback given, which was either positive or negative, and my dependent variable was test scores. For my procedure, this was all done online through Qualtrics. Participants read the informed consent form in Qualtrics prior to completing the survey. Participants were then given Math Test A. After completing Math Test A, Qualtrics randomly assigned either positive or negative feedback to the participants. Participants then completed Math Test B after receiving their feedback. Participants then completed the Are You Harvard material survey. And then lastly, participants read the debriefing statement. So Math Test B scores. We saw the positive feedback group, they averaged almost 10 questions answered correctly on Math Test B. They had 17 participants in that received positive feedback. Negative feedback, they averaged almost 9 questions answered correctly on Math Test B, and they had 21 participants that received negative feedback. So we ran a t-test for independent groups. Unfortunately, our p-value was 0.19, which states that there was no significant difference between the 2 groups on Math Test B. Here's a graph that shows the mean number of math problems correct for Math Test B. As you can tell, positive and negative feedback, they're pretty similar, and the error bars show standard deviations of Math Test B scores. So we ended up running another t-test, and it was for difference in scores. So when comparing the amount of answers correct for Math Test B, or for Math Test A and Math Test B, we see that the positive feedback group, they actually didn't do as well on Math Test B than they did Math Test A. We actually saw a slight decline in their performance. Negative feedback, on the other hand, they averaged about a question. They had averaged about one question better on Math Test B as opposed to Math Test A, which I found this very interesting because that was the opposite of what I predicted was what was going to happen. So we did have a p-value of 0.02, which did in fact mean that there's a significant difference between these two groups. And we had a large effect size with that as well, making our Cohen's d 0.83. Here's a graph showing the mean difference in math problems that were answered correctly from the difference between the two test scores. And as you can see, negative feedback saw more of an increase as opposed to positive feedback when taking Math Test B. We ended up running one more individual t-test, and that was for one of my Likert scale items, which was a bad test score motivates me to do better. The positive feedback group, they answered about a 5 on average for this Likert scale item, which stated that they somewhat agreed with that a bad test score motivated them to do better. Negative feedback, on the other hand, they scored about a 4, which stated that they were neutral about a bad test score motivating them to do better. So unfortunately, we had another p-value of 0.17, which stated that there wasn't a big significant difference between these two groups. And here's another graph stating the mean difference of the test scores on whether or not a bad test score motivated each group to do better on the next test. Conclusions. So participants who received positive feedback actually did not perform as well as participants that received negative feedback on that second math test, which, like I said, was very interesting because that's the opposite of what I thought was going to happen. So this is different from past research because in 2015 study, they gave specific feedback to their students or participants where I just gave generalized feedback. In a 1974 study, researchers, they selected their students in two different groups from high scores to low scores, whereas my participants, they did not know which group they fell into. And in a 2017 study, researchers, they had the ability to interact with their students, whereas I did not have that ability to do that. Some limitations of my study. You cannot generalize to an in-person environment. There's too many environments were different when taking this test, which definitely could have swayed the outcome of certain people's test scores. And the inability to grade tests in front of students, I feel like that was a pretty big factor on whether or not students would accept the kind of feedback that they got. So I felt that maybe in an in-person study or an in-person environment, that factor would be more controlled. For future research, I would definitely, like I stated before, I would conduct a real face-to-face class, and I would use real tests. I think when grades actually matter to a specific class, students are going to be more inclined to take their feedback more seriously, depending on what kind of feedback it is. And then I would give more specific feedback as opposed to generalized feedback. Surprisingly, negative feedback increased test scores more than positive feedback. Here are my references. And then special thanks to the participants, UTAs. Thank you guys. You guys did a great job all semester, helping all of us with our projects and keeping everything organized. And special thanks to Dr. Grover. She's great. She helped me out personally with a lot of questions that I had, and help guided me to where I needed to be. So thank you, Dr. Grover. Um, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email is listed right there. If not, stay safe, stay healthy, and Stingers out.